Hi, this is Tim Lightfellow in the Kingdom of Ontario Society for Creative Anachronism. The purpose of today's video is to discuss crossbow safety. The things I'm going to discuss might have some crossover between general equipment inspection, but also my focus is trying to look more as a crossbow user. What kinds of things might you look for and be aware of that could cause extra wear on things, misfires, anything that pertaining to uh, the safety around shooting crossbow. So to that end, I've got a couple crossbows here, so I'm going to grab one. One of the first things is stringing up crossbows, which there are different ways to do. I am unfortunately not in a great position here to demonstrate any of them, but I can talk through them. So let me get that off my face. One method I've seen people use is using the stirrup and hooking it on their foot. And what they'll do is they'll have someone work with them. So they'll literally grab the prod, they'll pull up on the prod and have someone else put the string on for them. So that's one method. One method is that I use occasionally, and I shoot 90, 95-ish pound, under 100 pound prods. And frankly, that's probably the upper limit of where I'm comfortable doing this method, is that I will take it, I will put it against my hip, I will put my hand on the top limb, I'll put the bottom limb on something like a curb or something that's going to be solid and hold it. And I will literally push with my hip so that I am bending both limbs of the prod. The trick, obviously, is you want to bend them as evenly as possible, because otherwise you can start to introduce issues in the prod if you're flexing almost entirely with just one limb or the other. And so what I'll do then is I'll have it hooked on one side, I'll push it and hook the other side. I didn't put them on since I'm doing a quick video, but I use leather spacers between the string and the metal, which can help keep the ends of the string, the loops, from wearing out extra fast against the metal, which is another potential safety thing. The third method I'm aware of for stringing a crossbow is what's often referred to as either, I've heard the terms dummy string and bastard string. And the idea is you have some sort of clamps that hook onto the prod, and then you have a string across. And so you literally clamp these on the prod, you pull this up to your string holder, whether you're using clap lock or roller nut or whatever, and then that flexes the prod for you so that you can put the string on. These were made for me by Baron, former Baron, might still have the title. I'm not sure if he was granted Baron. His Excellency, there we go, Bjorn of Glimmer. And what he did, I had been trying some different ways to make these, some with just string with loops and that, some with paracord, and all of them were really slick. So what I found with my steel prods is they would just slide and they wouldn't actually work the way they're intended. He found, I think he said it's a military grade heat shrink that includes an adhesive inside. So it bonds a little extra well to the metal plate and provides a good rubber grip to keep it from sliding on the prod. I would demonstrate this, but as you can probably see, there's a loose string here, so I need to remake the string before I use this again. But It's a little more time consuming, spending the time to hook this on, pull it, put the string on, undo the bolts, take it off. But it certainly is an effective way of making sure that you're putting pretty much even pressure on each side on the prod to avoid introducing metal fatigue by doing it, by putting more on one limb and doing it the same way every time, which can introduce that metal fatigue. That's what I'm trying to get out. Okay, so that's stringing up a crossbow. So then safety things to think about just with the crossbow itself before we even think about anything to do with shooting the crossbow. Just some things to be aware of, and I'm not sure how well this is going to show. I'm going to put this like right up to the camera. If you look at the string and the way it crosses the deck of the crossbow, or I think I've also heard the phrase table of the crossbow, you'll notice this one comes off slightly downward angle. So there's a little bit of downward pressure on the string. Now I'm going to grab my other one. I think it might be a little more obvious with this one how much this goes across here and then it angles downward out to where the tips of the prod are. What that means, the more angle there, the more pressure the string is putting on the deck or the table, it's going to wear out the serving on the string a lot faster. It's going to put more stress on the string. It's going to potentially put more stress on your steel prod. So that's something to be aware of, just in terms of if you have a way to shim it to try and ease that pressure a little bit, that can help. Otherwise, just having an awareness that, you know, especially I have some prods that fit the other crossbow so that the string literally comes off the deck and I mean, it angles way down. And so I know that if I'm in a situation where I'm stuck using one of those prods, I also know I'm going to have extra strings because I'm going to wear through the serving really fast and I'm going to be replacing serving. Okay, so prods themselves and with strings on them. Again, I mentioned for the demo, I put it straight on, but normally I have a leather pad in between here that keeps this from rubbing directly on the metal, which can help lengthen the life of the string. I've had one time that I can think of that I had a prod that had a little metal burr and I literally couldn't feel it until about the third string broke and they all snapped on the same end. And I went in with my fingernail and just kind of started rubbing around and finally found, oh wait, there's a ridge there. So having the leather pads can help reduce the surface area of the string against the metal and reduce any chances of burrs or anything like that causing issues. You also do want to check and make sure that you actually have a smooth surface for the string to sit on, or it can cut and literally cut through the string and break it. So that would be another safety consideration. Another one that I found about my second or third prod, I realized afterwards that the likely cause of its failure and breaking was that I was using a string. I'm trying to remember if it's when I ordered. Normally I make my own strings. I'm trying to remember if it's when I ordered or if it's one someone gave me because I was out and didn't have one at the time. But looking back on it after it broke, I realized that most crossbows, this distance between the prod and the string should be roughly 2.5 to 3 inches. And it was probably putting the string down more at 3.5 or so inches. And so what it meant was the string was too short. And that meant it was keeping more tension on the prod and introducing metal fatigue faster. So looking back on that one, it's no wonder the prod failed. So that's something to be aware of, is what your brace height is. You ideally, again, you want usually about 2.5 to 3 inches. Now, I've seen one person in Avocal whose string sits way up here. It's maybe 1.5 inches from the prod to the string, and it seems to work for him. So, what I'm giving is general guidelines, not specific to anyone's particular crossbow. Okay. Next thing to consider is if you use bow irons to hold the prod in. Number one, I always carry small hammers, and I carry a what they call a pin punch. So I can put the pin punch against the wedges and tap them to knock it loose, to loosen it if I need to change the prod or recenter the prod. I can also use the two hammers to push these in if it's coming loose and I need to tighten it back up. One thing I would point out, especially if you're in an area where there's a lot of rain or just a very humid area, is that I would recommend, even if you don't need to for the prod, taking this apart every once in a while, because what we've found is that sometimes if you leave it together too long, and especially if a lot of people may shoot a few rounds, get a score in for the year, and then put it away till next year, you can get rust in here, and then it can be really hard to take it apart when you actually need to. There's a long story about that involved emergency runs to an auto store, or a tool store, and lots of things like WD-40 and that, and different screwdrivers and everything to try and get the thing to come apart so that we could actually pack it in luggage. So again, that's not so much a safety issue, but it is something to be aware of for crossbow maintenance, general maintenance, is there is the potential of these wedges rusting together. So you may want to just every once in a while take them apart, make sure they're cleaned off with steel wool or something, wire brush, maybe put in a little WD-40. Obviously, you don't want to have them lubricated in a way that when you put them together, they're going to keep sliding back apart and loosening up, because then you're just going to fight it. Let's see, prod. So a rule change was put in place about prods, and it had to do with having some sort of cover on the prod so that if the prod breaks, you don't have pieces flying. So I have a couple examples here. Every prod I've had break. Now I only shoot steel, so let's be clear, I'm not referring to wood, I'm not referring to fiberglass. Has snapped right at what would be right at the edge of the crossbow body. As you can see, so here's center. It broke out here on the edge of the crossbow body, and it breaks when pulling the string, because once it's under the stress. I mean, that's the most stress, is flexing it from where it wants to be to being drawn back with all the energy stored in it. So I happen to use heat shrink on mine. Most of these from Alchem ship with heat shrink tubing, and I always add a second heat shrink tubing. Part of it for one of my crossbows was that I needed to add a spacer at the bottom, but then after breaking a couple prods and realizing that the second heat shrink tubing is what kept it from flying a couple times, I just go ahead and do it anyway, even if I'm not putting a spacer in. The one time I have actually had a piece fly away was a prod here that literally broke in two places at the same time. Never had it happen prior, haven't had it happen since. It's a rather unusual situation. It still broke, but it broke right inside the heat shrink, and so it didn't catch it. So that end flew, as I recall, slightly on range and down the line. So thankfully no one was hurt. But again, that side held as it should, which was the purpose for the cover. Now, the rules don't specify a particular cover. You can use heat shrink tubing, you can do a leather wrap, you can do a, I don't recall the exact name of it, but basically it's like a lace wrap where you just have a string and then every so often it ties around the prod. I know that that particular rule was of concern to some. And one of the things they did right into the rules is, I'm trying to remember the exact wording, which I can't, but the gist of the wording is, if your prod is already mounted and it's too much effort to remove it to put on some sort of cover, it's grandfathered in. If you use bow irons, it's not too much effort to remove it. If you do like the tie-on method where you have some wood blocks and you use sinew or artificial sinew, I've heard people describe that process and oh my gosh, yeah, I wouldn't want to go through that process just for the purpose of adding hi cat. Okay, just for the purpose of adding something onto the front of the prod. Let me relocate a cat. Okay, sorry about that. You all got to see Theo up close and personal. Okay, so that covers prods. That pretty much covers strings. You do want to keep an eye on strings like this one. I can see that the string itself is poking out through the serving. So I know that at some point fairly soon that's probably going to fail. Let's see, other safety. This particular piece, I've heard a couple different names and I can think of two of them. I've heard probably 4 or 5 different names. So I've always heard it referred to locally as like the crossbow finger, because it, reaches over and holds the bolt. I've heard it called, I think it's a bolt pinch. So there are several names for it. It is not, at least as of the society rules I read last, it is not a requirement. I do highly recommend it. What it does is it keeps the bolt going straight. So what I mean by that is if you have a roller nut, and it's going to be probably less an issue ever with this brass one than it might be with the vinyl plastic ones. A lot of those, when I get them, they're not right. They're not quite to my liking, so I end up filing it. So if I do it wrong, I could end up with a situation where, well, first, the idea of a roller nut is that when it gets down to the bottom here, should be when it lets go of the string, so the string is pushing flat against the back of the crossbow bolt. If it lets go up here, then you'll tend to see the string hit the top of the bolt and slide down and basically pinch the bolt down to the crossbow. And what I've seen sometimes is if it maybe catches a little and then it releases, it might bounce way down, and it can actually kind of, especially if you don't have a finger, it can hit like the bottom of the bolt and kind of undercut the bolt and throw the bolt up in the air if this isn't in place. It's not guaranteed to. It's not guaranteed to ever be an issue. Like I said, this isn't required. I do encourage people to use one because I've seen one or two crossbows where someone shot them without one, and they frequently had undercuts to the point where I saw one go straight up in the air about 10 feet and come back down. Thankfully, there's not a huge safety threat to that, but if you can easily get one of these, you can make one. I was looking for an example. I actually have some aluminum flat bar stock that I've bought from Lowe's that I've used in the past to fashion my own crossbow finger. This one came with this crossbow, and I actually ordered a couple more of the same to put onto my other crossbows so that I'd have the same style. And it's a spring steel, so it's going to last better. Initially, my first crossbow came with a brass one. What we found with that, it was so soft that, especially after timed ends, it would just be sticking straight up, and then after a few of those, it would just break. Which is why I went to the aluminum. It was a little more sturdy, a little more duration, and then going with this has greatly improved the longevity of the crossbow fingers. Okay, so again, not required, but I generally recommend it to people. Otherwise, like I said, some of the things you can have happen is, and that can tell you if you need to maybe modify the roller nut, and this tends to be roller nut specific, is if you're tending to have it come down on top of the bolt and just kind of pinch the bolt down, that means it's coming free of the roller nut before the roller nut is even with the table or the deck of the crossbow. So that means it's actually coming up and then hitting above the bolt and sliding down the bolt. So in that case, you probably need to deepen the grooves a little bit on the roller nut so the string settles in a little further, and that way the roller nut will have to spin a little further before the string comes out. If it's undercutting, again, the best advice I have for that is having one of these, because I mean, you can't let go of the string any lower than even with the deck. So at that point, it's potentially coming off like up here and then kind of hooking and then breaking free and slamming down. So you might check and make sure these are, that the very top is rounded enough and doesn't have an edge that might catch the string and hold it for just a brief moment. Otherwise, there may not be a lot you can do about it. You might check your bolts. Sometimes bolts might be curved so that they look flat along here, but it's near the end, it actually comes up off the crossbow a little bit. So that may be more of an ammunition issue. If you're using the type of crossbow that's a post, so wood post, you pull the trigger, the post pushes the string up. If you push that too fast, you could conceivably pop the string up in the air and make it go over and pinch your bolt down. I can't say that I'm aware of ever seeing anyone do that, but if you're having that problem and you're shooting that style of release, think about slowing the release down a little if you can and see if that corrects the issue. Clap block, it's kind of hard to have an issue with a clap block unless it's broken, because they literally are closed with the string locked in place, or they go tink and let go of the string up here. So there's really not variables with that. The biggest variable with that is making sure, if you're putting it in a wood body, that you have a groove cut out in the wood on each side for the string to rest in when the clap lock is actually locked down. My wife's had not a deep enough groove for a while, so it would occasionally just pop the clap lock back up because there was so much upward force on the string. It took us a while to figure out, and I finally realized, wait, there's the issue. We increased the cutout area, and the string sets even, and it's not been an issue. Okay, other safety, potential safety. If you have something like this where you have metal plates or something added to the side, like to hold the roller nut, such as this case, you want to make sure that it's even with the deck or the table of the crossbow. If it's below, you could end up with the string actually trying to jump to get from the roller nut up onto the deck. If it's too high, if it's really, really close but a little bit high, it's probably not going to be an issue. But if it's too high, then when you're pulling the string back, you might be wearing the string a lot against that metal, and so it might wear through the serving fast for you. The last thing I can think to mention just in regard to a crossbow itself is the roller nut needs to lock onto the trigger. We have a 3D printed roller nut that was going to be testing unofficial capacity in my side yard. And what I realized is I tried to put it on this crossbow. This one has a brass one that the axle's built in, but I have vinyl spacers to fill the hole, and a Chicago screw, or I think that it's also called is it a Corby bolt, to go through. And so I was able to put it in there, but what I realized was this trigger is actually physically wider than the standard Alchem or Slowbow trigger, which is what I normally use. And the roller nut that the pattern came off of was designed for that trigger. So I set this up with that roller nut, and the trigger wouldn't actually lock into it. So I immediately removed the roller nut so I wouldn't have any kind of temptation or forgetfulness and end up going out and shooting it when the trigger could not actually lock into the roller nut, because that would be unsafe. When it comes to actually shooting now, bolt length doesn't seem to matter other than the performance with your crossbow. But safety-wise, like I've shot, 13-inch bolts up to 22-inch bolts. No issues with any of them. I found the 22-inch bolts for mine didn't work as well. They weren't as consistent, so I stick with 16-inch half shaft. But safety-wise, no concern. One thing you do need to be aware of is some crossbows have been made strictly to use a 5/16 shaft, and that can be an issue because a lot of us shoot 11/30 seconds. So knowing that about your crossbow is a very important thing. So shooting, the other thing I can say specifically to shooting is when you're loading your crossbow. So once it's strung up, which since I don't have ammo, I'll go ahead and string this to demonstrate. So I've got it cocked. I grab my bolt out of my quiver. I put it on. One thing we warn people to be aware of and be careful of is don't load your crossbow like this. crossbow's at an upward angle, something bangs the trigger, bolt's going who knows where. You just shot a York shoot and maybe not on a York range. So we try and encourage people to think about when they're loading, keeping it flat. You generally don't want it down, because most of us have seen if you have a crossbow finger and it's not super tight against the bolt, or if you don't have one, angle it down and the crossbow can slide forward, which can cause issues with the shooting. So trying to be conscious and aware and keep it flat if you can, rather than angled upward, just because, again, if something accidentally bumps the trigger and it's angled upward too far, it's soaring, and that can cause problems. The other thing we try to encourage is, if you do a stirrup cock, which I do, which again, I'm literally just hooking it on my foot and then bending over and pulling the string. And I'm gonna undo it now. Okay, so get used to using your off-range foot, because if I put this on the on-range foot and I lean very far forward, if the shooting line's here, then it's the same thing effectively as leaning over to pick up an arrow that you dropped on the target side of the shooting line. So if you get used to using your off-range foot when you cock the crossbow, you shouldn't have to worry about any marshals taking issue with the way you're doing it. We have one guy who has been shooting crossbow since well before I ever joined the SCA, and he learned to do it with his on-range foot, and that's the way he does it. And so what he's done is he's modified it so he brings his on-range foot over to the shooting line, cocks it, and then puts it back out and does his shooting. That way he's leaning along the line when he bends over instead of out onto the range. So, other than that, there are variations in ammo. Most crossbows in this area shoot a 2-fletch bolt. I've talked to some people who use 3-fletch. On some of those, the 3rd fletch goes up. On some of them, they have a channel cut, it goes down. None of that really comes into play as a safety thing. It's just a matter of the way the crossbow is designed and what ammo it's designed to use. So, one other thing I would point out safety-wise. For these prods, for the string, I do continuous loop. Flemish twist is, in my experience, not strong enough to handle the amount of pressure that crossbows put, especially when you're getting 90 pounds, 100 pounds, because of the fact that they have no actual knot holding them together. They will tend to come apart. So strongly recommend a continuous loop string if you're shooting crossbow. What a continuous loop string is literally the whole string is one loop. So you start, you do however many loops you're going to make. Usually it's about 20 loops, so you have about a 40 strand string, and then the last loop you come back and then you tie it back to the beginning, and that part ends up in the serving, under the serving at the end, to help keep it locked together. So I think that pretty much covers safety with crossbows. I hope that this helps and is a useful video for people. Thank you for watching.